Hello, welcome everyone to this session titled Predicting the Future by Looking Backwards, a pro tip for project managers, to be presented by Marcus Hinds. This session is hosted by the Project Management Association of Canada and sponsored by IPMA USA, Procept Associates, and Title Shift. You will see the links to our sponsors' websites posted in the chat. During this live presentation, please feel free to type any questions you have into the Q&A window. After the formal portion of the presentation, we will read out your questions for the speaker to answer. This presentation is also being recorded and will be posted later on YouTube for those who could not attend today. Now let's get started. Momentarily, I'm going to turn things over to Marcus Hinds. With a robust background in engineering and project management, Marcus is also a professor of engineering at Humber College, where he mentors students in project execution, helping them bridge the gap between theory and practice. Now, over to you, Marcus.
All right. Thank you, Robin. Good evening to everyone. Thanks for joining our session this evening. I've got some slides that I'd like to share. I'm just going to go over to those now. So I'm hoping that you're able to see those on your screen, and I'm hoping that you're able to hear me well as well. So I'm hoping that everything is fine on your end. Now, I'm very excited about this topic, and it's because I usually see a problem, with companies and with organizations where sometimes in consulting and sometimes with working with different companies, you're helping them through their projects or you're working with them through their projects, and then they get to a particular point where the project is going off the rail or some issue is happening with the project, and you see everyone freeze and everyone thinks, well, what do we do? How do we get past this hurdle? And one of the things that I think is very valuable to do for project managers and for organizations is really to look back at what you've done previously, looking back at your previous projects and using that as a lesson, using that as something to take forward into the future and into your future projects and to help your current projects as well. So I'd like to welcome you to our session this evening, Predicting the Future by Looking Backwards, Pro Tips for Project Managers. Now, as Robin said, and thank Robin for that great introduction there, I've helped a number of different companies with their projects, with project management strategy, with several different project executions. And one of the things that I always notice is that companies usually fall into three tiers. So I've helped a number of different companies, and they fall into three tiers from my experience, or looking at all of my experience in terms of projects. Now, I wanted to outline those three tiers and essentially go a bit more into detail with them so that we can understand them in a bit more detail, so that we can understand how we can use this to come forward. How can we use the past, essentially, to go forward into the future? Now, one of the things here that's particularly important with your projects and looking back at your previous projects, well, you have to have something to look back at. You have to have something to essentially refer to. But you can only refer to something if all along as you've been doing projects, you're creating notes, you're creating knowledge, you're creating stories. In project management, it's what you call your lessons learned register, essentially. When you're doing a project and you see that something is going off track, maybe you're a little off track in terms of your budget, maybe you're a little over time or something of that nature, you make a note of that. Why is that the case? How did we get to this point? What contributed us to be here? Was it the fact that we didn't plan properly? Did we overspend somewhere? What exactly happened that put us in that particular situation? And making that tiny little note, I know a lot of us do it mentally, but making that tiny little note can actually be very beneficial in your future when you're doing another completely unrelated project and you look back at that and you remember, oh, you know what? We went over budget on this project 2 years ago. Maybe we shouldn't do that this time. And then we should probably make some sort of a process so that our future projects don't end up like that as well. So coming back to those tiers that I mentioned, the different companies and how they fall into those tiers, I find the first tier is generally where the frequency of recording those lessons learned, recording what happened on previous projects. In those scenarios, first tier, that is generally low. Now, in these types of companies, sometimes they're smaller companies, sometimes they're bigger companies, but generally they do not take the time to record any lessons learned. You know, if a project is over budget, whatever, it will catch up, or whatever, it'll finish whenever it finishes, or whatever have you. They're not necessarily taking the time to go into analysis and find the root cause of why that project is, a little bit astray. Now, there are a number of different reasons that this can be the case. Sometimes it's a lack of resources. There's no one to do this. Sometimes it's also time constraints as well, where it's not formalized. There's no process to kind of write down those notes or kind of take those notes as to what's happening on previous projects or present projects. And it's just not something that's done. It's not a part of the culture. So in that particular case where there's no routine in place, these companies usually fall into that tier, and you're really seeing one huge outcome from many of these essential companies. You're seeing one main piece of potential, and that's the fact that they have a lot of value to reap and a lot of gain, a lot of essential value to gain from being able to do that. Now, the second tier that I usually see some other companies falling into is the medium tier or the intermittent, the randomized kind of category. And that's where sometimes, sometimes lessons learned on projects are recorded, sometimes issues on projects are recorded, sometimes maybe if a project goes way over budget or way under budget or something, some kind of outlier that they've never had before, maybe that will be recorded, but not generally. It's not generally done. It's only done if something is really, really bad. And in this particular case, the causation of this is, there's no real clear process in place. It may or may not necessarily be a part of the culture. And the main value that I see coming here is that there is value from not only taking or starting those lessons learned. Of course, it will take some effort to get that done and get that formalized and rolling, but they also have or can reap value from formalizing that process. And that could look like something as simple as the managers within that organization saying, hey, we're doing this project. As you go through the projects, maybe every week, take a note. Maybe every 2 weeks, just scribble something in a diary or open a blank Microsoft Word page and say, a couple points about the project. Now, the third tier, and these are the easiest to work with because they have a formalized process in place already. And these are the ones that I like to call, high frequency of recording. That's where it's already formalized. That's where there's already a process in place where they actually take lessons, they actually record the issues on projects, and they actually formalize that. So you can go back 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, however long, and you can look and see what happened on particular projects, and you can see who was assigned to that project as well, and you can speak to that person. Now, that's not always the case because, of course, that takes a lot of effort to get rolling and some change management as well. If that's not something that you regularly do in your routine, that's something that's going to take a little bit of effort to do. So you have to get over that hurdle. Now, the great outcome with these types of firms is there's value to be had in continuing to streamline that process or continuing with those lessons learned essentially on projects. But the main piece of value that I see there is to be able to then take those lessons learned and apply them to future projects. So it's one thing to look back and say 2 years ago we had a project that was over budget, and 1 year ago we had a project that was over time. But what does that mean for your projects now? What does that mean for your projects in 1 year? And unless you can take those lessons and synthesize them and learn from them and go forward into your future, it's not going to be of much value. So that's where the main value comes in. Looking at your previous projects, looking at your present projects, and essentially relating that to your future project by not making those same mistakes that you made before. So constant improvement, essentially. Now, when you get into creating your lessons learned register and recording your issues on projects, when you get up to speed with this, you're going to have to maintain it. And there are a number of different ways in which you can maintain it. There are a number of different ways in which you can essentially keep it going. So here's what you have to consider when you're doing this. So creating and maintaining an up to date lessons learned register. And up to date is the key word here because essentially, let's say if you do a project today or you did a project a month ago, where does that knowledge go? Where does that essential learning go? Of course, we make a mental note of it, but is it recorded anywhere that we can actually look back and remind ourselves and kind of explain it more to ourselves or explain it to someone? The general saying is that a picture is worth 1,000 words. So is there a picture that we can refer to that we can understand more of what's happening and the dynamics of what brought that project to be where it is? Now, some things that we have to consider here with our lessons learned register and recording our issues on projects. What's our update frequency? How often are we taking these notes? And that could range depending on the company from anywhere to once per month. It could be several times weekly. It could be several times daily. It could be once every Wednesday. It could essentially be anything that works for the project and works for the organization. But the main thing here is that there is benefit and there is value to having an update frequency, sitting at a certain time per week or sitting at a certain time per day or even standing or having a meeting or whatever have you and saying, okay, over the past week, I've learned that this particular project is XYZ over budget because of A, B, C reason. And going forward, we have to avoid A, B, C, C, D, E, E, D, E, F. Right, so that's the main point there. The upgrade frequency is something that you can look forward to. And on top of that, it helps you to get into that rhythm. If this is not something that you're doing already with your projects, it helps you to get into that rhythm of doing that. So it could be something as simple as 5 minutes on the calendar. It could be as simple as, a timer. It could be something as simple as making a note to yourself every evening after you leave the office or something of that nature. It could be something as simple as that. But the main thing there is that there's benefit and there's value in that. Now, another thing to take note of is the fact that you have to determine what's going to be valuable on a project or not. So I'm not talking about the minutia here. I'm not talking about the little everyday kind of operations, so to speak. Like say, for example, you're making notes or you're taking notes about a project and you're thinking, okay, manager came into manager spoke to Sean spoke to, that's not necessarily important. What's important is taking the actual knowledge out of the project. So in this particular case, looking back at this project saying, okay, we're over budget because we didn't plan or procurement, or we didn't get something delivered on time, and then we had to get it re-delivered, or something of that nature. Actually knowing the root cause, actually understanding why that project is the way it is, and being able to learn from that, and most importantly, implement that to future projects as well. So you have to determine what's valuable, and you have to sort the valuable knowledge from the minutiae and the fine details and the ones that don't necessarily mean anything. And in some cases, it can be mixed together, but the main thing is to know how to harvest that information once you're looking back at those lessons learned. Now, the good thing about this is that it saves time on future projects. Because, for example, when I spoke about those organizations that sometimes they get to a particular point in a project and then they become stuck, they're like, what do we do here? Well, if you look back at your projects that you've done for the past 3 years or the past 4 years or something of that nature, you'll see what happens when people become stuck, provided that knowledge is there. So once that knowledge is there and you look back at it, you're able to understand what is being said, you're able to understand the root cause, you're then able to think, okay, yeah, last time they were over budget because of something that failed on the project. Well, now we can essentially look out for that. We can add that as a risk. And then even before we get our project started, even before we start to plan it out, we already have that on our radar. So we don't have to go and plan. We don't have to go reinvent the wheel and figure out how are we going to deal with this if it happens. So it helps you to save time on your projects. You don't have to keep going back at and looking at the same risks all the time like that. And that leads me into my next point as well, which is the fact that it reduces risk and it reduces your cost as well. So the fact that you have different risks that can affect your project as you're working through it, if you already know that it's a risk and you're already looking back at your previous projects and what was done before, you already have an idea of what can be done if this risk realizes itself. So let's say, for example, you have a software project, there's a very high risk that it will be late because of some news article or something of that nature that came out recently or something of that nature that's going to directly impact it. Well, now if you're looking back at that and you're taking that lesson, you already know that that's something to look out for. And you can already put a plan in place. Okay, so if this happens again, if this happens this time, we're going to do A, we're going to do B, we're going to mitigate it in some way. So it helps you to save costs in that way. It helps you to save time in that way. And then it helps your project to flow more smoothly in that way, hence increasing your project efficiency and how well you get your projects done as well. Now, I have a framework as to what that looks like. And like I said, a picture is worth 1,000 words. So I always like pictures. I always like a diagram or an illustration or something of that sort. And this is what I'm showing you on my screen now. I'm hoping that you're able to see it. So in this particular case, like I said, on the top left, the most important things with your project as you're going through your project is to identify what will be a lesson or what is a lesson or what could help you in the future. You have to sort the minutia out. You have to sort the unimportant details out and what's going to be important for you going ahead. And this may not necessarily be something that you know, but recording it can be something that will help. For example, what I mean when I say that, you may not necessarily know that your project 2 years ahead into the future in 2026, you may not know that your project may be behind schedule and over budget. But if you would have recorded some information from some of your previous projects before, that may actually ring a bell where your head or your brain connects to that idea. Wait a minute, I had a project like this before. What did I do then? And reading those notes, reading those lessons learned, and even the issue log may be able to help you with that as well. It may help you to connect those dots. So once you identify those lessons, you have to find a way of recording those lessons. And recording those lessons can look like anything, like I said. It could be voice notes to yourself. It could be simple notes to yourself. It could be a diary, and you just scribble in that diary from time to time. And it could be just a huge Microsoft sheet, Excel sheet, Word sheet, anything of that nature that essentially you use to record those lessons. And of course, as you go through, it'll get bigger and bigger. In some cases, those documents can be, 200 and 300 and 400 pages long as well. I actually have one, and that's how I keep some of my notes sometimes. My document is actually up to 453 pages right now. So, as we keep going through that, it'll of course increase. Now, this is the action of what I call repositing lessons or making a repository or depositing lessons. The two words are interchangeable essentially. Now, there are some things that you have to think about here. How are you going to store those lessons? Who is going to have access to those lessons? And what is my confidentiality going to be like? Let's say, for example, you leave your current organization, you go to another organization or something of that nature. Are those lessons something that someone coming behind you are they going to have access to that? So repositing those lessons, making that lessons learned register, that's something that you have to kind of sit and figure out what it's going to look like. Now, even if it's confidential, even if certain persons have access to it, who's going to have access to it? Is it going to be for your sole access only? These are all things that you have to kind of ask yourself, and that will depend on the type of work that you're doing and the environment that you're in. Right, so there are a number of different things there that you have to think about. Now, the final part of this is to review those lessons, and that's where the work really comes in. That's essentially, if we're looking at this as a project, this is where the work comes in, reviewing those lessons, looking at those lessons, taking knowledge from them, and most importantly, finding a rhythm, finding a time slot to actually review those lessons. Making the lesson is one thing, but actually going back over and reviewing them is something else. And this could be something as simple as 5 minutes or 10 minutes per week, where you just kind of skim through your notes. Or if you're having a particular issue on a project, you do a word search. So let's say you search for over budget in your document that's 400, 500, whatever pages long, and you look for all the matches for over budget and you see what's there. And then you realize maybe a project 6 years ago was over budget, a project last year was over budget. And then you could start to look at it that way. So there are a number of different ways you can go about it. There are a number of different ways you can get creative with it, but the main point that I want to iterate here is the fact that there's value in looking backwards to catapult yourself into the future so that you can execute projects with high efficiency and be one of the best project managers that you're destined to be. Right? So that's one of the main things there that I want to iterate. Now, if we look at the path coming out of reviewing those lessons, you'll realize there are a number of different paths here that this can take. And I'll go into this a little bit more into detail on the next slide. Now you'll see that reviewing those lessons interfaces with recording those lessons. So that's going to become kind of a circular process, reviewing and recording. You can do them both at the same time. You can have an interval for one, you can have an interval for the other. And then on top of that, you may also want to have access to other projects or other persons that are doing other projects to review their lessons as well. And that's where that arrow comes up and goes outside of your project and into another project, so to speak. Now, the main thing with this is there are a number of different things that you have to determine here. What went well on your past projects? What benefited the project? What needed improvement and what hindered the project? What can be generally improved around your project? And what was something that doesn't necessarily need to be improved, but it can benefit, it can help in some regard. And those are the main things that you have to determine when you're looking at your lessons learned. Now let's drill down into those reviewing of lessons or reviewing the lessons or the task of reviewing lessons a bit more. Now here's what that looks like or can look like. Here's what it has the potential to look like. Now, for larger projects, you could have the project team focus on, their general tasks, their general day-to-day project tasks. And you could have a dedicated person or a dedicated team that goes and reviews other lessons and brings that learning to you, essentially, i.e., a consultant, right? That's one of the things that you can have a dedicated team or a dedicated person that is helping you with that. It could also be worked into your project management office. If your organizational structure is such that you have a project management office, that is something that they can encourage or that is something that they can do on your behalf as well. So review previous projects, review previous lessons, and then bring that learning to you. It could be in the form of making an accessible library. So even all the files that have been compiled by people managing projects, by people on the project team and whatnot, that could be something that is made available to persons doing projects in the future so that they can learn from that knowledge as well. Or it could be the fact that they would have kept journals, actual physical journals, and it could be just a small room where the journals have been copied and you have access to those journals. So it could look any way, essentially. It could be a digital library, it could be an actual library, it could be anything. And even if it's an actual library, this is an artifact within your organization that it actually can look kind of cool. A small room that has really tall bookshelves, and then you have books all over that persons can access, along with other project management books and other subject matter expert books as well. So that's something that you can use. Now, keeping with the theme of today's conference, looking at the future, one of the things I wanted to talk about as well was AI models, because some of them are becoming very powerful and some of them are becoming very smart at what they do. So that's another potential that we can have, where we have AI models looking back at our previous projects and looking back at some of the learning from our previous projects and advising us as we go through our current projects and through our future projects, various things to look out for. So look out for, making sure that you make a complete risk register, and not only your risk register, but making sure that you have a contingency plan for each and every risk that is there in your risk register. So we can have AI models advising us to do that because that's something that can be helpful for us as well. And remember, that can be a tool. Yeah, it can be a tool. It's not something that replaces us. It's not something that blocks us out. It's something that we work along with to help us to get better as well. So that's one of the main things there that can be particularly helpful for that. And if you're so inclined, you could definitely use those AI models for that as well. Now, to look at some methods that this can be done, as I mentioned before, they could take several different forms. And this is where you, as the project manager or the person on the actual project, you have to kind of get creative. Now, not only do you have to get creative, but you know what suits you best. You know what you feel best in terms of doing. So for some persons, that could be meeting notes of weekly or monthly or whatever frequency project meetings. So that can be meeting notes from project meetings. It could be a software package that you use and all the different notes that you make within that software package. An example, Slack or Microsoft Project or any of the other software packages that we use in project management. It could be anything of that nature. If you're a creative person and you think in lines and structures, it could be something as simple as a mind map. It could be a diagram. It could be doodles. I once had a manager on a project that, essentially his notes were just all doodles and kind of little cryptic notes to himself. Now, no one else could really understand this, but he understood exactly what it was he was looking at. And if that's something that you feel comfortable doing, if that's something that you feel that would work for you, that's the way that you can take your lessons learned as well. So there's several different ways here to be flexible. There's several different things here that you can do that essentially can feel very easy for you, very, very essentially natural to you, that doesn't necessarily have to make it feel like something that's a chore or something that you're forced to do or something that you don't necessarily want to do or something that's tedious, right? So there are a number of different ways you can approach this. Now, another thing I do as well, which I found that has been particularly valuable, is keeping a professional journal. Now, there was a project that I worked on, a large organization quite some time back, probably about 6 or 7 years ago. And it was a huge project management project, but it was also a change management project as well. So they had some infrastructure, they had some assets. And when they were looking at their assets and analyzing their assets, they wanted to implement a tool that would help them to determine whether to repair the asset and get it up and running again, or to replace the asset and replace it with something that's brand new or something that's even more modern. Of course, there are costs attached to each. So the main software that I was trying to implement in that particular project was to kind of weigh the two options. Is it better to repair or is it better to replace? What is the best scenario here based on the current factors that we are facing? Now, with that project, I got to the same point that I mentioned before, the point where I was stuck and I was like, where do we go from here? So in that particular case, I was kind of thinking, okay, well, what do I do? And what I did was I used some investigative techniques, tools, tasks, essentially, to find who the project manager for previous projects and similar projects were, any software implementation within the organization, who that person was or who those people were. And essentially, I was able to find a project manager that I can connect with that was still with the organization, but in a different role, in a different department, a different location. Now, we were able to chat, and that person gave me some of their notes for similar projects that I was working on. And one of the things I remember coming across was, a note that said, if you're implementing software, make sure that a particular person, and call the person by name, let's say John in IT or Jane in IT or something like that. Let's say, let's ensure that Jane in IT or John in IT ensures the importance of your project. And the reason for that, the entire workup for that, was that sometimes IT gets very swamped and sometimes they're responding to emergencies. This system offline, there's a glitch with this other system here, it's a critical system and things like that. So sometimes they're not necessarily thinking about churning out other stuff. So in this particular case, what it was really saying was to make sure that someone in IT, someone that you can actually connect with and tap with and what's not, make sure they understand what it is you're doing and the importance of what you're doing, because they'll most likely take it under the wing and kind of help you personally, so to speak. And in that particular case, I was able to use that lesson from an earlier project to make contact with someone in IT. And then I was able to ensure that I could speak with that person from time to time, and ask them questions. Hey, how is the build out of, the particular tool going? And then they were able to relay information for me, to me, to say, well, it's going to take 2 more days. It's going to take 3 more days. We should be ready in 4 days, and so on and so on. And then I used that to be able to then inform my project and kind of plan it out that way as well. So I could plan my budget to suit, my schedule to suit, my scope to suit. I essentially had more information. I was more informed because I was able to do that. And I could only do that because those previous lessons learned were there, right? So that's one of the things that's particularly important there as well. Now, your lessons learned can be as simple as letters to yourself. If you're some person that writes a lot, you could open something on your phone and you could essentially write that way. You could type that way. There could be voice notes to yourself as well, self-recorded podcast. It could be anything. It could take any form. But the main thing that I want to iterate here is you have a lot of benefit and a lot of value in doing that. And then it could also look like sharing lessons as well, formally sharing lessons as well, where you meet with other project managers or other persons that maybe managing similar projects to yours. And essentially you kind of share, some of the issues that you may have run into, and then some of the things that you did to combat or to mitigate those issues as well. So it could look like networking and informal talking. It could look like formal sharing sessions where it's an organized time each week or each month or whatever have you to sit with other persons that may be managing projects and essentially using that as a way to, manage your lessons learned. So there are a number of different ways here. Now, some pro tips as we get into the end here, just about to finish up in a couple minutes here. The pro tips is that your lessons learned register, or LLR, should have pointed that out earlier, your LLR, lessons learned register, your issue log, all of that. It should be ongoing throughout the project's life cycle. It should be ongoing as you're executing the project. So from the time you strike the charter or from the time you're assigned to a project, there may not be much learning then, but what are some of the things that you can note then? And as you go through and you ramp up to doing the actual work of the project, I'm sure more lessons will learn or more lessons will present themselves to be learned as you go through that. So as long as you start very early on and you continue that, it'll essentially, become a part of the project where it's second nature to the project, where if it gets to a point where you've somehow missed recording that lesson, you kind of think to yourself, oh, I haven't recorded my lesson for this week or for this month or whatever have you. I need to go ahead and do that, right? So it's one of the most valuable sources of project knowledge, because in some cases, it can remind you of some of the persons that were on that project team. It could remind you of the project manager, and then you may, in some cases, be able to speak with that person, and there'll be a lot of value in that, right? Now, the great thing about this is essentially free, or there's a minimal cost or investment attached to it. The investment here is something that you have to do. It's something that you have to dedicate time to. But like I said, that could be as simple as 5 minutes per week. It could be as simple as 5 minutes per month. It could be every 2 weeks. It could be whatever works for your schedule. The main thing I want to say there is that there's value in doing it, regardless of what your frequency is. Right. Now, it also provides extra sources of risk and risk mitigation or risk identification, where let's say you're working on a software project, but you're looking at a project that was building a building or something of that nature, completely unrelated project. And you realize they ran into some issues with their budget because the budget wasn't planned properly. That could then remind you, oh, you know what? Let me take a look at my budget because that particular project ran into an issue because of that. So now that's an extra risk that you would have identified that you would not have necessarily otherwise thought of before. So it can be a point where you can use it to get extra risk and get wider reading on some of the risks that can present themselves, to your project, and you can kind of mitigate those as well, right? Now, another thing that's particularly beneficial, and I find this in engineering as well, in some cases, they're hybrid contracts, heavy industry contracts, and the contracts work in a number of different ways. And I find that that's one of the things to note as well, especially if there are any precedents set, especially if there's a new type of contract that you're testing out or something of that nature. The main learning there, the main lesson to take from that is, how did it perform? How did it work? What were some of the things that we need to improve on? What are some of the things that went well, right? And that's one of the main things that you have to ensure that you do there, reaping the value from those lessons. Now, the final thing I want to say here is the fact that your failed projects produce a lot of value because you could determine exactly why they failed, and you could essentially use that lesson for that. Or or your successful projects, they also hold a lot of value as well, where you're looking and analyzing those projects and determining exactly why were they successful, what helped us to get ahead in that particular scenario. A little something that I like to call, the failure or any failure fueling the future, essentially, fail forward, so to speak, more than anything like that. Now, you'll realize here that the value on the right-hand side, the little diagram that I have there, value is in gold. That's because this is where you can really reap the gold from your project, looking back at those previous lessons learned and using those essentially to help you in the future with your projects. Now, I was looking at studies from PMI, documented by PMI, and I realized some interesting things here. So this is a study coming out of PMI, Trevino and Adnatamula, 2008, and they were looking at a number of different organizations. So like I said, this is an actual PMI documented study, right? Now, what they were looking at is they were looking at projects and organizations that had no project management framework. So that's where in an organization, one person says to the others, hey, I need an update on the software that we use every day. And the response is, all right, well, when do you want it? By the end of the year. And that's it. There's no other plan after that. There's no talk about budget, schedule, time, who's going to provide it. Are you working with vendors? Are you going to build it out yourself in-house? There's no other kind of thoughts about that. There's no real project management plan in place. There's no project management framework in place. It's just really goals, and they're trying to achieve those goals somehow, however they achieve those goals. Now, those types of organizations, those types of firms, they usually have up to 70% chance of failure on those projects. And just because it's not planned out properly. So for example, when I say, I need a software update by the end of the year, I can now come back and say, well, I couldn't get it done. I couldn't find a new software update. And then it's the end of the year. Now, the second tier are the companies that have some project management framework. So in those particular examples or those particular cases, they say, hey, I want a software update, but I want it by the end of the year. And if that doesn't work, I want it by January 15th latest, right? So they have some resemblance of a plan. They have some idea of where it's going to come from. They spoke about vendors. They kind of put aside maybe $10,000 for this. If anything goes wrong, maybe an extra 5,000, but that's about it, right? So they don't really have a clear plan, but there's some resemblance of a plan there. Now, based on that study, those types of projects, those types of organizations, they have a 20% chance of failing because they did a little bit more planning beforehand. And the organizations that have a clear project management framework, which is where they determine who the vendors are going to be, they determine what the communication is going to be like as they're doing this project, they determine who's going to supply it, who's going to manage the project, who's going to be a part of the team, what dates they're looking at, what dates are the contingency date, how it's going to flow from task A to task B and task C and so on. Those types of projects have a 10% chance of failure, especially when you incorporate lessons learned or previous lessons learned into them. So there's benefit there. You can see you can get your failure rates or your chance of failing all the way from 70% all the way down to 10% just using some of these framework or using some of these tasks essentially. So it's great value and great benefit in that. Not only that, provides organizational learning, where this is something that you can learn and the entire organization can learn from implementing projects. It promotes the forming of systems as well, which is where, on every project, regardless of what department or function you're in, every Wednesday at 2 p.m., you take 10 minutes and you essentially record those lessons learned that you would have learned over the past week or so on and so on. So it makes forming a system much more easy in that particular regard. And on top of that, it helps the project team to learn as well. Now, the final thing that I want to end off here with saying is that there may be some resistance to this if this is something that you're thinking of doing in your organization. But the main thing, like I said, is to start small. Start smart, start small. Start with tiny little increments. So maybe 5 minutes per week, or maybe 5 minutes every 2 weeks, or something of that nature. And as you go ahead, and as it becomes something that's more formalized and more comfortable, you can probably increase it to 10 minutes every 3 weeks or something of that nature. You can essentially play with the feature or the frequency that will essentially be most useful for you. Now, the final thing I want to iterate here is the fact that looking back at your previous projects is something that can catapult you into the future with your future projects, and taking all of those lessons learned that you would have had from previous projects, all of those failures, all of those successes, using them to essentially help you with your upcoming and your future projects as well. Now, that is the end of my presentation today. I want to thank you for having me. I'll turn it back over to Robin to see if there were any questions that came in, and then we'll get off to our next module after that, enjoying this great IPMD day. Some great presentations I saw here, really enjoying it. So thanks for that, Robin. Over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Marcus, for that presentation.
Mhm.
We do not have any questions in the chat
All
at the
right.
moment, so I
Okay.
will give a minute, I will remind audience members that you can type any questions you have into the Q&A window,
Mhm.
and I can read them out for Marcus to answer
All
for
right,
you.
sounds good. Yeah.
Can give it a minute
Yeah.
here.
And I'm just gonna grab some water while that happens.
So we have a
All right.
question from Dow.
Okay.
Do you have concrete of the lesson learned register example?
Um, I could take that question in two ways. So that could be concrete evidence that it works, or concrete that of an actual lessons learned register. And to both of those questions, I would say yes. On many projects that I work on, or any projects that I consult on, or help any organizations with, or something of that nature, as I'm going through the project, I make little notes. One of the reasons I do that is because I think to myself, I can't remember everything. So even if there was a small little cue, like say, for example, I realized maybe a project manager and someone on the project team very early on in the project, they're not necessarily gelling very well in terms of their working styles or something of that nature. I take a note of that very early on, and I keep that as a note to myself so that as I come back to the project or we're getting into the execution of the project, that could be something that could potentially amplify itself where they're not completely not getting along at all. Communication has completely broken down, and then the work on the project stops. Right. So, yeah, I think that is definitely one thing to do. Using that concrete evidence, that's something that can be definitely helpful. Yeah. Now, the second part of that question, where I have evidence of that, yes, absolutely. Every project that I've worked on, using those lessons learned has helped me in so many different ways. I've seen it help other project managers as well. Early on, I gave an example of an organization that I was working with, an infrastructure organization, engineering organization, where it helps in that particular regard. In that particular scenario, it helped me to kind of be on alert to ensure that IT, which was going to be a major part of the organization that I was relying on to implement the project, make sure that they understand the importance and the priority of your project even beforehand. So seeing that and thinking of that even before I got into the work of the project, I already knew to look out for that, right? So it's definitely something that can help you in that regard as well. So yes, there's concrete evidence that it works, and then I also keep concrete evidence of a lessons learned register as well. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you, Marcus.
Mhm.
We have a question from Eduardo.
Sure.
How to keep motivation when you feel the senior level speaks been adopt has been adopting PM practice framework, but they
Mhm.
don't really follow it. Any tips on how to do it?
Yeah. Um, One thing that I would say there is sometimes they do adopt project management practices, but they've gotten so good at it, or they've gotten so comfortable with it, that they don't necessarily express it anymore. They kind of do it in their heads, more to speak. Now, that's not necessarily the best practice. My concern there would be the fact that they are aware of the project management practices in the first place, making sure that they're still thinking of them, even if they're not expressing them or writing them down, still making sure that they're incorporating them into their projects more than anything else. It can be discouraging to see that. It can be discouraging to see that they're not necessarily doing it. But I think one of the things that will come down to is, having a conversation with them, asking them, hey, do you remember to look at your risks before your project and things like that? Did you remember to, check the issue log for previous projects and stuff like that? Sometimes it could be something as informal as that. And, in some cases they may say, yes, I absolutely did that already. And, in other cases they may say, no, shoot, I forgot that. You're right. In some cases. And in some cases, it may not necessarily be something that they're interested in. It all depends on the organization that you're in. But the main thing I would say there is to at least, kind of mention it and kind of get it in the open and discuss it from there.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah.
I do have another question.
Sure.
Have you done any lessons learned with some stakeholders, and has that been in meetings or in writing?
Oh, I didn't catch all of that question. Can you repeat it for me, please?
Have you done
Uh-huh.
any lessons learned with some stakeholders, and has that been in meetings or in writing?
I've done a bit of both. It will depend on the project that you're working on and what suits the project. In some cases, it could be something that looks like a meeting with the project team. and you say something as simple as, hey, I saw a project very similar to this one, 6 months ago, and they ran into issues with ABC. They ran into issues with building out their software. They ran into issues with implementing their software. That could be something that we then look out for based on that particular knowledge. So that could be something that can be done. It could be something that is as informal as that. But the value here is to kind of understand and realize when it's being done and how it's being done and where it's coming from as well. So yes, I've done that on projects and as a part of helping others with project consulting on projects as well. Yeah,
Okay. Looks like that is our last question.
great.
Give it
Okay.
1 second here. Okay. Amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you again, Marcus.
Thanks for having me, Robin.